Okay. Thank you, Craig. When Bill Vandergiesen contacted me, Don Rhodes had suggested that he asked that I speak about the Battle of Lake Erie. And I thought, well, if there's one thing that people know a lot about, it's the Battle of Lake Erie, right? I mean, if you're in Ottawa County, now if you're in the United States at large, the War of 1812, I refer to it as the Rodney Dangerfield of American wars. No respect, and nobody ever heard of it. If you're in Baltimore or you're in Ottawa County, you know about the Battle of Lake Erie or the Star-Spangled Banner. I think most people hear the Star-Spangled Banner, they think it's a football fight song. Or if they hear something about the Battle of New Orleans, they just think it's a Johnny Horton, one of his best ballads. My thought was, when Bill asked me to speak about this, that since we know a lot about the Battle of Lake Erie, I thought it might be more interesting to put it in the context of the military campaign associated with the Battle of Lake Erie. The War of 1812, it was notorious that the Army and naval officers had a very fraught relationship. Not so with William Henry Harrison and Oliver Hazard Perry. Their relationship was very close and very effective. The fact that the amphibious invasion, not D-Day, but the amphibious invasion of Canada was launched from the mouth of the Portage River, I thought might be of some interest since we're here in Ottawa County. For a little bit of background, the War of 1812, it's interesting. In England, of course, had been in a world war, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. It was waged in India, it was waged in the Caribbean, it was waged throughout Europe. England had the biggest navy in the world, a very small army. They controlled Canada. The United States was a neutral in the war, and we were very distressed by the fact that the British were seizing American ships that we were trying to trade with France. Well, picture World War II. A neutral country says, we want to trade with Nazi Germany. What would we have done? Well, what did the British do if an American ship said, we're on the way to France? Life and death struggle, it was all over. So they also seized American sailors, and because they could not send any troops to North America, you ask about the War of 1812 in England, trust me, nobody ever heard of it. It was a sideshow. I mean, for them, in a world war, this didn't amount to anything. So they tended to have a close relationship with the Native Americans. So whether it was in the French and Indian War, the Revolution, War of 1812, the British, because they couldn't send troops, were reliant upon Indians. Problem with relying on Indians is kind of hard to tell them what to do. And when the battle's over, guess what they are apt to do? And guess what they're apt to do to women, children, settlers in Erie County or Ottawa County or Seneca County? Very dangerous. So people in the West were very concerned about this. The problem we had was the American Army was infinitesimally small, poorly officered, and the soldiers were not like the World War II veterans we know and respect. These people, you had many opportunities in this country. So the people in the Army were often the dregs of society. They got paid very poorly, the work conditions were very bad, so we didn't have a big army. We decided that we would rely on citizen soldiers, all right? Citizen soldiers. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the Jeffersonian Democrats, they feared a big military. They thought that was a threat. They wanted a small government, that governs best, that governs least. So what did they do? Everybody 18 to 45 was in the militia. And twice a year you had a rendezvous, and a local pal put out a keg of whiskey, and you elected your officers. And who would you elect? Right? You know, who put that barrel of whiskey out? So they were very good, because it's almost like the Olympic Games. When it came to a battle, what do you suppose they did? Well, they set Olympic records in the broad jump, the high jump, and track, running. I mean, you can imagine, if they took any of us and put us in a situation like that, no training, no drill, had to bring our own weapons, wouldn't have been very effective. So as we contemplated declaring war on England, what was the strategy? What could we do? We didn't have much of an army. Well, Jefferson had an idea, and keep this in your mind, sort of a theme we're going to talk about. Jefferson said what we could do is taking Canada would be merely a matter of walking. We could just go up to Canada, we'd grab it, maybe we'd keep it, but if we didn't, we'd have a bargaining chip, and the British couldn't do much about it. Just walk up and grab it, all right? So, well, we'll see how that went. The war was fought all over the place in many different theaters, very disjointed, very unsuccessfully, and when the war was over, guess what we got to show for it? Zero. Nothing. None of the goals we were going to set out were achieved. The winners were, who knows? The losers, the Indians. Okay, let's take a look. This is the theater of war. So we're going to walk to Canada. We're not going to talk about the War of 1812 anywhere but in the Northwest, and particularly in our area. So here we have, if you're going to walk to Canada, you got a problem. You got to be able to do a little swimming or have a boat. The supply lines for the British were 1,000 miles long. So think about this. All the way up to St. Lawrence, Lake Ontario, Niagara Falls, Lake Erie, all the way up. So they had a real problem. And again, they're involved in a world war. They don't have a lot of resources to devote. The logical thing to have done would have been what Montgomery did and Arnold in the Revolution. That's go up the Hudson, Lake Champlain to the Richelieu River and cut them off. If they'd done that, what would have happened to everything in the West? You know, nothing, it would be over. But we didn't do that. We decided to invade on all three different routes. Now, we're most interested, of course, in the West. Now, let's take a little geography lesson here. Here we have Fort Detroit, an old French fort, big garrison, 50 guys. Fort Michilimackinac, how many have been up to see the fort at Mackinac? Been up there? Yeah. All right. Big garrison, 50 guys. Fort Dearborn near Chicago, 50 guys. All right, so no roads in the area. Here is Fort Meigs. Many of you perhaps have been there, a great museum if you haven't visited, in Perrysburg. Here's Fort Stephenson in Fremont. Here is Fort Malden, maybe new to you, in Amherstburg in Ontario. That was the British naval base and their base in Upper Canada. And just for future reference, this is Lake St. Clair, and this is the Thames River. You see that? Heading east, okay? So the idea was we're going to invade who's going to do the invading? Well, in the West, the governor of Michigan, William Hull, happened to be in D.C., and they asked him, would he command a force to go to Detroit and be prepared to invade Canada? This is before the war was declared. He said, I wasn't born yesterday. And this is the second theme we got to remember about. He said, they don't grow many crops up there. You know, it's fur trading. If we take a large garrison up there, how are we going to supply them? The only way this can happen is two things. One, we have to have control of Lake Erie so that we can supply. And two, we have to make sure that the Indians are not involved, because the Indians were sitting on the fence. The British had betrayed them in the Revolution. They betrayed them in the French and Indian War, Pontiac's Rebellion. So this is a dangerous mission, so I'm not doing it. So they appointed somebody else. Well, he got sick, he couldn't do it. They went back to Hull. They said, look, we're going to pay as governor, and you're going to also be the general of the Northwest Army, double pay. He thought, we just might pull this off. So who's going to do the fighting? Well, you had the 4th Regiment, but it was going to be Ohio militia. And they picked 3 key guys, James Findlay, Ohio, from Cincinnati. They picked Lewis Cass, eventually Secretary of State, presidential candidate, governor of Michigan, and they picked Duncan MacArthur. And they called up the militia, and about 2,000 guys rendezvoused, and Hull would lead them north. So this is what northwestern Ohio looked like. Ohio was a state, 1803. But northwestern Ohio was Indian territory. No roads, no settlements, no settlers, completely cut off. Here's the old Treaty of Greenville line. That was the frontier. The problem with getting through this area was, you probably all heard of this, the Great Black Swamp. Today we drive through the area, we see these beautiful fields, we see these ditches 20 feet deep, and so it's been drained. But back then, to get through this was a major challenge. You couldn't do it in the spring. You would sink literally up to your knees. In the summer, late August, you might get through okay, or in the winter if it was frozen. Otherwise, it was a major obstacle. Now, here's the problem. Back then, these soldiers and the oxen and horses that accompanied them had a very bad habit. They liked to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Yeah, you know, the horses. The problem is, say you have an oxen, say you have a horse, and you're moving north. What are they going to eat? Not much. So the horse, after a few months, is done. The oxen. And the soldiers, they needed something to eat. So say we're starting out from Urbana with a wagon, and we're going to go to the rapids of the Maumee, or we're going to Detroit. So we load it up with food and supplies. What happens every day to those supplies? So the problem is trying to, it's hard because they're diminished every day. So logistically, this was a major challenge. Now in the Indian Wars in Ohio under Mad Anthony Wayne, he had learned that the key thing to moving into these Indian areas was every 20 miles you had to build a fort. Okay, some of these became towns later on, like Fremont or Tiffin or Findlay or Upper Sandusky. So the key to moving north was, how do you get through this particular area? And in this case, what Hull did is I'm not going to read it, but I have a letter from Hull, and he says the water is too low in the Miami River, so we're going to, and he thought he'd go up the Miami, and then down the Auglaize and down the Maumee. Makes sense. Too dry. So he went to Urbana, and they headed north from there. They didn't take Route 75. The problem was there was no road, there were no bridges, so they had to literally cut their way through. And every 20 miles they built a fort. One of the forts was at Fort Findlay. James Findlay was the guy who built the fort, got it named after him. And so they finally got up to Detroit. By July 5th they got there. Now, war had been declared on this 18th of June. So he had sent out before the war was declared. He invaded Canada, issued a proclamation, we're going to take care of you, we're going to follow these laws and rights, and then things began to deteriorate. He was very concerned, oops, I skipped one. He was very concerned about the Indians. And again, in the interest of time, I have a letter here from him. Well, I might mention some things. He says, this is dated on the 29th of July. Last evening, 2 Chippewa Indians arrived at this encampment from Michilimackinac with information that the British were in possession of that post. They state that Mr. Askin, the Indian agent at St. Joseph, landed with about 30 regulars, the same number of Canadians and near 1,000 Indians from Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Green Bay, and that they had 3 pieces of cannon, had moved them or were preparing to move them to the high ground which commands the fort. Mr. Askins proceeded toward the fort with a flag and was met by Lieutenant Hanks. That remained together some time, and when they separated, Mr. Askin called his party to advance, informed them that the fort was theirs, and entered without opposition, a gun being fired. Problem was, nobody told the Americans that war had been declared. British heard, they said, hey, they grabbed it. So what's going to happen as a result of this? The Indians are hedging their bets. What are we going to do here? What are we going to do here? Who was the great Indian leader? Tecumseh, one of the greatest Indian leaders of all times. So there was certainly, and how did we treat the Indians? You know, it was pretty bad. I mean, you know, didn't honor the treaties. We'd make a deal with Chief Thunder Thud, buy up a big chunk of Indiana, and say that, and then he had no more claim to it than anybody else. So it was not good. So the Indians were obviously disgruntled, but with the fall of Mackinac, they thought, ha ha, this is our chance. And so they flocked to the British. Okay, now Hull, no American ships on Lake Erie. The British control Lake Erie. He can't get supplies. He sends a couple expeditions south to try to link up. They're both defeated. Then Sir Isaac Brock shows up, Tecumseh shows up, and on the 16th of August, Hull surrenders the whole Northwest Army of the United States. All right? Basically what Brock said is, look, you surrender, I'll guarantee your safety. You don't surrender, I can't control the Indians. I don't know what they'll do. Okay? He surrendered. So what happened to the people living in Danbury, in the Firelands? Guess what they did? They split. And of course, not far from here, we have the skirmish on the peninsula. The militia flocks to this area from Cleveland, the 4th Division Ohio Militia, and we have a skirmish here on the peninsula. But all the settlers were long gone, all right? So this impinged on the people living right here. You said, a little aside, it's kind of funny. The British couldn't feed these captives, so they took them in ships and they dumped them off along the south shore of Lake Erie. Well, guess what? All the locals thought, British ships, British invasion. Back to the track records, 100-yard dash, marathon. People ran like holy hell. It was really amusing. They were really frightened. Okay, so question, how is the walking going? Not only did we lose Detroit and Mackinac, and I'm not going to read all this, but Hull says he's going to have Fort Dearborn evacuated, and he did. And guess what happened to the people on the way back? They got butchered, all right? Yeah, slaughtered by the Indians. They ate the commander, they ate his heart and everything else. It was pretty gruesome. So clearly we're not off to a good start. So that's the end of the first phase. Now, time for a new commander. And that is William Henry Harrison, future President of the United States, former governor of Indiana, victor at Tippecanoe, highly regarded in the West. Unlike these old fossil dugouts from the War of Revolution, he was younger, he had served under Mad Anthony Wayne, he knew the ropes. And so here we are in a very awkward situation. I'll just tell you another walking. They got across the frontier at Niagara, at Queenston. Guess what happened? Captured. So, how are we doing? Jefferson's down at Monticello. I wonder what he was thinking. He didn't say anything about it. So Jefferson, pretty good guy, and he set out, his idea was, and this is kind of, in a way, it's kind of dumb. You think about during the Revolution or during any war, Civil War, what did armies tend to do in the winter? Bunker down. Winter encampment, Valley Forge. So you look at the Civil War, you don't have the major battles happening in January and February. But you can imagine the pressure was on in the United States. Now, one thing happened is we got the idea, gee, maybe we do need a fleet on Lake Erie. And so, thanks to Daniel Dobbins, we began to build a fleet at Erie, Pennsylvania. And of course, eventually, Oliver Hazard Perry became the commander of that, on Lake Erie, of that fleet. But while that was going on, the British had total control of Lake Erie. They could go anywhere they wanted to, we could not. So, was his idea. His idea was to advance to Detroit to recapture it. The key juncture was at Fort Meigs, which is on the rapids of the Maumee River. That is the head of navigation for ships on the Maumee. And to get there, what he was going to do is he was going to have a three-pronged attack. Remember, if you have one road, one line, you can't feed everybody, right? So he's got to have few troops up front, advance supplies. So he moves up the Auglaize and builds a fort every 20 miles. Fort Amanda, Fort Jennings, right on up. Fort Defiance becomes Fort Winchester. In the middle, the old Hull Road, another force under Tupper is going to move up here, and on the right, they're going to build a fort at Upper Sandusky, Fort Ball at Seneca, Fort Stephenson, and then up there. So 3 different prongs are going to come up in the winter. Now the problem is the militia, when you signed up for the militia, you signed up for a period of time, 6 months, 3 months. What do you do at the end of 3 months in the middle of the winter? You go home. So there's nobody left in the fort, that's their problem, not mine. And don't forget, if you're a militiaman and you have a farm, you got a family, you got crops, you got a mortgage, you got debts. So, I mean, they may be patriotic, but problem? Okay, so he establishes the fort, begins to supplies, and the big mistake happens. Often when you get a 3-pronged attack like that, cell phones were not working well, no good communication. General Winchester on the left wing, some people came down from Monroe, Michigan on the River Raisin and said, hey, the Indians are molesting can you help us? He said, of course. He goes up to the River Raisin, to modern day Monroe Vision, and what happens? The whole left wing of the army is defeated, captured, made prisoner, and the Indians butcher the prisoners. The wounded are abandoned by the British, and the Indians simply slaughter them. So how are we doing on the walking? All right, so Harrison retreats back and builds Fort Meigs. The British were under a lot of pressure from the Indians. They'd been betrayed by the British before. They didn't have a lot of faith in General Proctor, and so he was under a lot of pressure, and in May of 1813, the British fleet, British Army, thousands of Indians attacked Fort Meigs. Fort Meigs held, but there was a relief expedition coming up from Kentucky under General Green Clay. I love that name. And Green Clay was ordered when he got to the fort to send a group to spike the British batteries on the left bank, while he and the rest of them should come into the fort. Well, they did that. But instead of going into the fort, evidently some Indians made some obscene gestures or insulted, thumbed their nose or something, and the Kentuckians started chasing the Indians. The Indians would fight a little bit, retreat a little bit, fight a little bit, retreat a little bit. Then they surrounded and butchered. Of the 800, 650 were killed or made prisoners. How's the walking going? All right, not so good. Now, at this point, a new Secretary of War said to William Henry Harrison, said, look, dum-dum, almost in those terms, he said, look, you can't get to Detroit by land from the frontier. It can't be done. Look what's happened. We lost Detroit. We lost a whole army. We lost the right wing of the army, and now you've lost a huge number of people in Dudley's defeat. What we're going to do is Oliver Hazard Perry is going to gain command of Lake Erie. We're building landing craft in Cleveland at Fort Huntington, and we're going to have an amphibious invasion. We're going to go by boat. We're not going to try to fight and supply these troops. And that's when the focus switches here. Because what Harrison did is he moved his headquarters to Fort Seneca, which is modern day Old Fort, okay? Just south, about 9 miles south of Fremont. If you go down Burchard Avenue, I only put this up here as a placeholder, not that you can read it, but there is a little monument there, to the fort. And so this became the headquarters. And when we think about it, so here's the supply line, the old Scioto Sandusky Trail, and here we have Fort Ferry up here, Fort Ball is at Tiffin, Fort Seneca, and this is going to be it. And the invasion, Armstrong, Secretary of War, said, we're leaving from Cleveland. Harrison said, no, we can't do that. Let's leave from, guess where? Ottawa County. Not Ottawa County then, but mouth of the Portage River was the goal. Okay? Now there was a little problem before they could, so the troops were there, and he called for reinforcements from Return Jonathan Meigs, our governor, and from Isaac Shelby, the governor of Kentucky. Called for reinforcements in anticipation of Perry's victory. The boats that were built, flat-bottom boats that were built up at Fort, many of them had been moved up to the Sandusky River and sunk in the river just to keep them safe, okay? Not that they were lost, they were sunk. So they were there, and we're getting ready for this, and the British, Tecumseh put tremendous pressure on the British. He said, we have to try to attack Fort Meigs again. Hopeless. The British ships were blockading off Erie, PA, blockading Perry's fleet. Said, we're going to, we have to do something. And Tecumseh had a brilliant idea. He said, what we'll do, they didn't have the big ships, they didn't have the big guns, they didn't have the artillery. What we'll do is we're going to go out in the woods and we're going to shoot them up, boom, 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 and then we're going to make them think that there's a relief expedition under attack. They'll come out of the fort, and that'll be it. Problem. Biggest rainstorm anybody remembered. Green Clay said, we're not coming out of the fort. It was a bust. So now what do? Well, we can attack Cleveland, or we can attack Fort Stephenson at Fremont. And the decision was made to attack just south of here in Fremont, all right? So the British had about 600 troops. Tecumseh had a couple thousand Indians. There were 800 and some attached to the British. Their biggest ships were off Erie. What they should have done if the British had been smart and had been able to reinforce Proctor, what they should have done is attack Presque Isle, where the fleet was being built. Because on the 3rd and 4th of August, when those ships got over the bar at Erie, PA, as of that date, Lake Erie was in command of the Americans, period. Before the Battle of Lake Erie, we had control of Lake Erie. And so that was the fundamental change in the history here, and it leads up to this invasion we're going to talk about. So, at Fort, Harrison, anticipating that the British might attack Fort Stephenson, ordered this man, Major George Croghan, who commanded at Fort Stephenson. He said, if the British were to attack, you must abandon the fort. It cannot be, it's not important, it can't be sustained, okay? Now, Croghan's an interesting guy. His uncle was William Clark of Lewis and Clark. Another uncle was George Rogers Clark, the great Revolutionary general who had captured Kaskaskia and really got us our claim for the whole northwest of the United States. He'd been at Tippecanoe, was a favorite of Harrison's, and so finally Harrison sent a messenger to him on the 29th of July and said, abandon the fort. The messenger got lost. He got the message on the 30th. He sends a message back, says, ain't no way, because the Indians had begun to invest the fort, and he said, we can't abandon, it's not safe to abandon the fort. Well, he disobeyed orders, so Harrison sent James Vincent Ball and the 2nd U.S. Light Dragoons and Major Wells of the 17th Infantry to arrest Croghan. And that's very interesting. How many have heard of the Ball's battle with the Indians? Couple. When I was a kid, think of, we all heard about Custer's Last Stand, right? And of course, back then, remember Cowboys and Indians, the movies. To find out that pretty dynamic things happen right here. You didn't have to go all the way out to the Little Bighorn. So, on the way, the squadron, about a mile south of the Hayes Presidential Center on Burchard Avenue, right at Tucker, there's a little monument. I think I have a picture. Yeah, doesn't amount to, it's hard to find, it's just a boulder in somebody's front yard. So here's what happened. I think this is kind of fascinating. In our backyard, the squadron were moving towards the fort when they were suddenly fired upon by the Indians from the west side of the road, whereupon Colonel Ball ordered a charge. and he and Sweet, and the right flank being in advance, first came into action. The colonel struck the first blow. He dashed in between two, and I love this, very politically incorrect, between two savages, all right, and cut down the one on the right. The other, being slightly in the rear, made a blow with a tomahawk at his back, wherein by a sudden spring of his horse it fell short and was buried deep in the cantle and the pad of his saddle. Before the savage could repeat the blow, he was shot by Corporal Ryan. Lieutenant Hedges, following in his rear, mounted on a small horse, pursued a big Indian, and just as he had come up with him, his stirrup broke and he fell headfirst off his horse, knocking the Indian down. Both sprang to their feet when Hedges struck the Indian across his head, and he was falling, buried his sword up to the hilt in his body. Yeah, ooh. At this time, Captain Hopkins was seen on the left side in pursuit of a powerful savage, when the latter turned and made a blow at the captain with a tomahawk, at which the horse sprang to one side. Cornet Hayes then came up, and the Indian struck at him, his horse in like manner evading the blow. Sergeant Anderson now arriving, the Indian was soon dispatched. By this time the skirmish was over, the Indians, who were only about 20 in number, being nearly all cut down, and orders were given to retreat to the main squadron. Colonel Ball dressed his men, ready for a charge should the Indians reappear. Not bad, huh? All right, savages, huh? Yeah, this is interesting. They didn't really go for the Native Americans. Okay, so Harris, they arrested Croghan, took him back. He said, look, this is why I did it, and made amends with her, sent back to the fort. Okay, Fort Stephenson. This is a second U.S. Light Dragoon, by the way, what they look like. You know, pretty neat. Here's Fort Stephenson. Okay. The neat thing about Fort Stephenson is we don't even know where most of these forts from the War of 1812 were. We don't know where the blockhouses. Every town had a blockhouse. You know, there are blockhouses all over the place. They're gone. Fort Stephenson is where the Burchard Library is in Fremont today. I think many of us have been there. The beauty is that the terrain is such that you can literally see where the fort was and where everything happened very clearly. It's not just flat and dull. And so here's the fort. It had 160 able-bodied men and one cannon. All right? I mean, it wasn't much of a fort. It had been built, originally it was a factory in 1805. The U.S. in the Treaty of Greenville had maintained key posts in the West where they would have trading posts, and this was one of them. So there was a section of land there, Detroit, in Perrysburg, where we controlled that. So, but then it had been reinforced. After Hull's defeat, everybody left, and the supplies were left and everything else. In fact, the skirmish on the peninsula, Paul Moon and I know a lot about this, the skirmish on the peninsula, these guys that was initiated when they sent people from Huron up the river to try to get some of these supplies. Then they sort of got sidetracked. Okay, here's the fort. This would be Croghan Street. You see this blockhouse here? And you see this ditch? Well, you couldn't see the ditch very well from a distance. And in this blockhouse, right here, facing in this direction, they placed the one cannon they had. Initially, they moved it around the fort, firing here and there to give the impression they had a lot of cannons. This is the location of the fort. And if you're standing there in front of the library, here's Croghan Street. It's in this ravine. I mean, it's quite low. You can almost see exactly where the fort was. You can see where the blockhouse was. This used to be the high school junior high across High Street. And this is a map of the thing. This today would be the Sandusky County Courthouse. This is Court Street, where the artillery were, and there's a monument there. There's a couple of plaques. And here's the fort. Here's where Croghan Street is today. This would be Garrison Street back here, okay? So the British arrived, they were sighted on the 31st of July. On the 1st, they began to land. They did not have large ships or large cannon. They had some 6-pounders and a mortar and a couple of small gunboats that were able to shell the fort. And the battle took place on the afternoon of the 2nd. So here we have the fort. And the attack took place. There were 3 columns of British that left from Court Street. And if you're standing on Court Street, in front of the courthouse, it's a park, you can just look right over to the library. You can just see where all this transpired. It's very logical. 3 columns of the British attack. They did not know about this ditch. And it was folly. First of all, the Indians weren't stupid. Guess what they did? They had 800 Indians. They weren't going to get involved. The Indians don't go up against, a fort or a blockhouse. Tecumseh had 2,000 Indians to the west. He wasn't directly involved. The British had about 500 or 600 troops. The same troops that had fought throughout the war for them. Basically, very few reinforcements, very few supplies. They were pretty much on their own. So, in the afternoon, they launched the attack, and this is probably what I collect a lot of stuff. I collect original documents primarily on the War of 1812 in our area. If I can find a letter or a document that's not published, I buy it. And strangely enough, over the years, I've actually found some pretty good stuff. This one, never published, and I think I have a docketed copy of Croghan's official report of the Battle of, the Siege of Fort Stephenson. It's good. But official reports are pretty dull, and the commander always tried to cover himself by mentioning all the things that different people did. This guy, Sergeant Joseph Bickley, he was in the 2nd U.S. Light Dragoons, that would be Ball's group, and he'd been sent on an expedition. They sent out expeditions along the lake, keeping an eye out for the British. Where are they going to land? And an expedition that had been sent out earlier was returning. He had been sent out from Fort Ball and encountered them, and they said the British were coming, and they returned on the 1st of August, they returned to Fort Seneca. So he was not at the Siege of Fort Stephenson, but he was there the day before, and he showed up right after the battle. Now, this is the letter, and I think it's worth reading. Dear Sir, I don't know who he wrote it to, dated the 3rd of August, 1813, so right after the battle. It is with pleasure I inform you with a pleasing intelligence from Lower Sandusky, which is as follows. Day before yesterday, myself with 6 others went from this place to Sandusky with Major Bodley. Our spies had got in, who had been down Sandusky River and brought news that the British were moving up towards Sandusky. We remained there about 3 hours and returned to this place, Fort Seneca. About 10 minutes after we started, the British made their appearance. Several of our men were out of the fort, and the Indians killed one and took another. Colonel Elliott demanded a surrender of the fort. Major Croghan, who commanded, told him he had been preparing for him, and before he would surrender, he would bury his bones in the ashes of the fort. Pretty good line. I don't know if he really said it or not. The British then erected their batteries within 150 yards of the fort, Court Street, and commenced cannonading, but not very brisk. They continued firing slowly until yesterday evening about 3 o'clock. When the firing began much sharper, everything continued so until near sundown when they attempted to storm. We had but 1 cannon in the fort, a 6-pounder, which was placed in a position to rake an outside ditch. Okay, remember this is the copy of the letter. The outside ditch, right here. So this is where the assault is coming from, over on Court Street. Okay, moved up there. When they got to the ditch, they thought it was the dirt thrown up against the picketing. Some active men jumped across, but many fell in. So soon as our men saw this, and having their cannon well loaded with slugs of lead, they discharged it twice before any could get out. Nearly every one were killed. This dampened their ardor. And they retreated from the picketing. So soon as it grew dark, nearly all of those killed and wounded were taken off by the Indians. This morning, the pleasing news arrived at this place. General Harrison, with our squadron and 500 foot, marched immediately for Sandusky, where we reviewed the scene. 1 lieutenant and 21 privates were lying dead in the ditch. 25 privates and 1 sergeant were prisoners, 12 of them badly wounded. Those that could walk were marched to this place. Proctor had there about 500 British and 2,000 Indians. Major Croghan had but about 200 in the fort, only 140 fit for duty. We had but one man killed and about 10 wounded. After the British retreated, some of their men decided to come to the fort. They say 200 of the British were killed or wounded and many Indians. Major Muir of the British Army was wounded. The colonel who was killed is by the name of Short. When the British were ordered to storm, Colonel Elliott told them to show no quarters. Proctor and Elliott fell back when they attempted to storm. We have about 2,000 regulars here beside the squadron. Pretty good? And Bodley and a bunch of these guys enlisted on Perry's fleet. Perry's fleet was so understaffed. He served in the Battle of Lake Erie on the Caledonia. Now the interesting thing here is, eventually over where the middle school was, they dug up the remains of Colonel Short. And if you go to the library, they have a room there with some artifacts. They have some of the buttons and various things from him. And his father was a British minister, and he said, you know, my greatest regret in life is that my son was killed in the middle of nowhere for nothing, you know, at the siege of Fort Stephenson. So they have those remains. Okay. Naval commanders, people who won victories in the War of 18, were all awarded medals. Croghan didn't get his till 1835. Now this is the question I ask for you. The British had 500 troops. Harrison had 2,000. What was Harrison doing listening to the battle 9 miles to the south? What would Ulysses Grant have done? What would George Patton have done? What would Robert E. Lee have done? Well, Harrison came in for some tremendous criticism, and deservedly so. And after the battle, I have a series of letters that Croghan wrote, and he basically said, I stuck up for you, I saved your butt, and you haven't given me any credit. And so there was a tremendous enmity there between the two. Finally, he got his medal in 1835 when a Democratic administration was in Congress. Old Betsy, how many have seen Old Betsy? I think everyone, right? Yeah, Old Betsy, why is it still there? Well, the key thing is you look at Old Betsy at the breach, there's a lot of damage to the breach. You know, you can see, I don't know whether a cannonball hit it at some point in its past. It's pretty banged up. And so in the 1850s, they were able, in an arsenal, to find the cannon and to bring it back. And they shipped it, and back in the days when you had Upper Sandusky, Middle Sandusky, Lower Sandusky, and Sandusky City, they sent it to the wrong place. They sent it to Sandusky. Guess what they did? They glommed onto it, yeah. So it was a heck of a stink trying to get it to go back. This is the dedication of the Soldiers Monument, and you can see Old Betsy, clear back then. There she is, right there. That was the fort, in the fort. In 1906, Rutherford Hayes' son, Webb, Medal of Honor winner, was very interested in the siege of Fort Stephenson, and he was instrumental in having the remains of George Croghan brought from Locust Grove in Louisville, Kentucky, and buried right there where he achieved his greatest victory. If you've never seen it, if you go to the checkout counter in the Burchard Library, this is a beautiful stained glass window with Croghan. He is my boyhood hero. I went there in the 3rd grade and said, boy, this is the greatest guy, nice looking young man, you know, hero. Later on, alcoholic, a spendthrift, a deadbeat, just a really not a very successful life after that. His wife finally had to get a legal separation to save her resources. Okay, war's over. Troops are heading toward Fort Seneca for this invasion. All right, first thing has to happen, of course, is Oliver Hazard Perry has to win the Battle of Lake Erie. I'm going to mention a couple things about it, but we're not going to go into detail. We all know that probably the painting of Perry in his longboat going from the Lawrence to the Niagara, in the State House in Ohio, in the National Capitol, in the stairwell at the Senate, probably the greatest image of the War of 1812. I mean, it's the standard image, and that guy had a way with words. We have met the enemy and they are ours. flying the "Don't Give Up the Ship" flag before he gave it up. This is my favorite print. This is the birch print from the 18 teens. I really like that. I wonder, we can't turn all the lights off. So anyway, look at how corny that looks. The real corny one is the William Walcott. I mean, look at that. The only thing accurate in this picture is there is a boat, there are some boats, and there's water. And I mean, this obvious. I mean, this is not a. Thank you. Does that? We can't just turn these off. Maybe, I don't know. Okay. So Perry, of course, wins the Battle of Lake Erie. This is a print that I own. By B.J. Cahoon, who was a purser on the Constitution, designed the funeral car for Perry's eventual funeral. And it gives you a better idea of the Battle of Lake Erie. Much smaller ships, and notice that the smaller gunboats, they're small. They were rowing them into the battle. There was it was a very light breeze. The key things about Perry is we know he was a hero, he was charismatic, he commanded the Niagara, and he's very lucky to win the Battle of Lake Erie because he screwed up big time. There was the British were on half rations. I mean, he could have waited a month, he could do it, but he went into that battle and he forgot one thing. He had 9 ships and he commanded 1. And that ship was destroyed and surrendered. And so he came out really fortunate that he got to the Niagara, and the British had lost their key officers, and in trying to turn the Queen Charlotte and Detroit, they became entangled, and that was the end. So he came out smelling like a rose, but he was a hero, but not a great commander of a fleet. I only want to mention a couple things just for the fun of it. So after the Battle of Lake Erie, what did they do with the enlisted men?
Throw them in a lake.
They pitched them in the lake, called Burial at Lake, I guess. Yeah, they just threw them overboard. Sewed them up in their hammocks, put a cannonball in there, and over this. They did have a religious ceremony. Thomas Breeze conducted it, and that was the norm. But I think that's surprising, because in the middle of the ocean, that's one thing. But when you're right off Put in Bay, you can see the island. Maybe you could have maybe they didn't have the time to dig a hole. I don't know. So anyway, 3 of them washed up. Yeah, this guy washed up at Oak Bluff Cemetery in Berlin Township in Erie County. We're going to put up a historical marker. It's been approved and it's been ordered. He washed up. Elman Ruggles, the surveyor of the Firelands, actually found the body and paid to have him buried and had a funeral service for him. 2 of them washed up in Avon, and they're in the park there. Six of the officers, 3 British and 3 Americans, were buried on land. And you would think they would have a significant monument, Rivera Park, and you've all seen the Cannonball Monument. When we stagger over from the bar there, there it is. This is where they were buried. The problem is, when they built Perry's monument and they dug them up, guess what they found? Nothing. There's a real debate as to what they found. They don't know whether it was a horse or a goat. They were hard up. They built this big monument, and Ohio Historical Society did some excavations there, and there's a real question as to what they found, but they sure didn't find any 6 officers buried there. And if you look at the little coffin they took up to the Perry's monument, it's pretty small. So whatever they found, I don't know what it was. Interesting, another little aside to the Battle of Lake Erie. The first big public monument in Ohio, statue, was the Perry statue in Public Square in Cleveland by William Walcott. All right? But after the Civil War, guess what happened? Well, they built the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and they moved it to the side. And then they moved it to Wade Park. And then they built the Cleveland Museum of Art in Wade Park, and they moved it again. And then they moved it to Gordon Park. And the weather was so bad that it was corroding, and so they had a bronze statue made, and they sent that one to Perrysburg. All right? And then they moved the statue, the bronze one, to Fort Huntington Park, where as it is today. A horrible place, a nondescript location. It's just an embarrassment. He's sitting there looking at some dull build office building across the hall. It's terrible. So the statue ended up in Perrysburg until they had it cast in bronze, and then they lent it to the government. Now it's over at Put-in-Bay. So the deal is that Perry got around more, the statue got around more than Perry did. This is how many have seen this monument? Paul's seen it. Yeah, there you go. It's on Gibraltar Island. So there was a move afoot in the 1850s to have a monument, a Perry's monument built. And de Rivera, who owned South Bass, donated land on, or a good part of Gibraltar Island for the monument. And they were raising money. I have different things that they had, pictures of the Lone Willow with the committee, and they were getting donations. So Jay Cook bought the island. Now, I would like to think our favorite son from Sandusky was a patriotic man. But there are those who say that he built a Perry's monument to clear the title, so he could say, there it is. And it's still there today. And so that way nobody could say, oh, this is where the monument is. He said, yeah, it's right here. So very few people get to see this one. Of course, we've all seen Perry's monument, and that's where the remains of the 6 are buried. Okay, so now the troops are congregating at Fort Seneca, and they're moving toward the mouth of the Portage River. No Port Clinton back then. Now, we would assume that what you could do is go down the Sandusky River and then out through Sandusky Bay and around to the mouth of the Portage River, right? No, they didn't do that. They went to the Leary Passage, which is Fulton Street in Port Clinton. And at both ends of Fulton Street, there's an obelisk, and I strongly recommend you're reading it. I one time went to one of them, and the plaque had fallen off, so I pinched it. And I gave it to Paul Moon, and he had it put back on. So, but the plaques are, there's so many momentous events that took place along that road. What they did is they took the boats that had been built in Cleveland, that had been in the Sandusky River, and they drug them across Fulton Street. They drugged them all the way across to the mouth of the Portage River. Didn't want to risk going out through the channel of Sandusky Bay. The other thing they did is Governor Isaac Shelby, the first and 6th governor of Kentucky, Revolutionary War hero, he arrived with 4,000 troops on horseback at Port Clinton. Now, how do you get 4,000 horses to Canada? Well, the Miller Ferry wasn't running. And so what they did is they built a fence from Sandusky Bay to Lake Erie on Fulton Street, brush and butt, and they left some guys behind, and they left all the horses east of that. So they had the run of the peninsula. I have some documents of people petitioning Congress $50 for the horse they never got back. So they had to abandon their horses, and they would go to Canada and fight on foot. So Governor Shelby, it's interesting when I do history walks in Sandusky. Sandusky, the streets, many of them are named after Revolutionary or War of 1812 heroes, including Shelby Street. I've never had anybody know why Shelby Street was there. It's because of Isaac Shelby. And Shelby showed up. Harrison had a preference for Kentuckians. He didn't like the Ohio militia because their track record had been very poor, and the Ohioans were offended. He wanted to rely on the Kentuckians. So although there were Ohioans who went along, not many Ohioans were involved. He wanted to be involved with the Kentuckians. So here is the route that Shelby took. He basically followed Hull's Road, came up the Sandusky side of the trail, Route 53, and went across, and then the Army began embarking on the 21st of September. Then they were then transported to Put-in-Bay, then to Middle Sister Island, which was solid people, and then on to Canada. And I have a couple letters, strangely enough, written from the mouth of the Portage River right on the day of the invasion. One is by John OFallon. OFallon, Missouri is named after him. He was the first cousin of George Grogan, and he was the aide-de-camp of Harrison. He says, And this is dated the mouth of the Portage River, 18th of September, 8 days after the Battle of Lake Erie. Our victory upon the lake was so complete, the capturing of the whole British Navy on this lake, 2 small vessels of no consequences excepted, that the greatest obstacle in accomplishing the object of the operations of this army is now removed. I contemplate upon our being in possession of Malden and Detroit in the course of 5 days. Which done, I believe, is the general's intention, after proceeding for the retaking of Mackinac, to move down the lake and cooperate with the Northern Army. Our troops, regulars and volunteers, are in high spirits, are anxiously awaiting the moment when they will be permitted to measure their strength and skills with the enemy, which I trust is close at hand. Pretty good, huh? I got a better one. I think this is hilarious. This guy's a bit much, a little affected, I think. Okay, Lieutenant Clarkson, 2nd U.S. Light Dragoons. So here he is, mouth of the Portage River, 18th of September, 1813. I think these are 2 of the earliest letters ever written from modern-day Port Clinton. Listen to this is just great. The drums and fifes are now playing. Strike your tents and march away to the shores of Canada. The troops are fast embarking. Ere 48 hours rolls around, the American army will be displayed before the walls of Malden. And no doubt, in very short time, the American eagle will victoriously expand her majestic wings over the ramparts of Malden. How about that? Woo. Dear Vance, the period is not far distant when I shall have an opportunity of proving to my friends whether I am or not worthy. I shall command as first lieutenant and probably be at the head of a company. I hope I shall be able to give a good account of myself after the action, which must necessarily take place in a few days. And then, and it was interesting too, he was dating William Henry Harrison's daughter. And then he says, I have not been able, all right, the Kentucky mounted men are all dismounted, the horses left in the peninsula, which is fenced in, also a strong guard to be left. The Kentuckies are keen as ever for fight, and I presume they will have their satisfaction. Dear Captain Vance, now I must bid you adieu, though I hope not forever. But should it be my unfortunate fate to fall, I shall not be in so disgraceful a manner as to cause you to regret ever being my friend. How's that? Guess what? He got to, I found out what happened to him. Got to Canada, got sick, never saw any action, quit the Army 2 weeks later. So, didn't amount to much. Okay, this is the Obelisk, and I'm really pleased with this. The efforts of people in Ottawa County, Port Clinton, to save the lighthouse. Darrell Brand and others, I think it was fantastic. And the beauty of it is, by saving the lighthouse and developing that park, in the past, the Obelisk, you'd have to park on Fulton Street and walk over. Nobody ever got to see it. Now they have a walk around the pond, and this will be something that people can actually see and read. And the plaques on it are well worth reading. And so this is where the Army left by the 27th for the invasion of Canada. Now, the problem with this is, all right, the Niagara Frontier, now who controls the lake? We do. So the British now at Fort Malden and Detroit, they can't supply themselves. The other thing that most people assume is, okay, they have 2,000 Indians. So the Indians are out shooting deer and everything and feasting and having a good time. And no, Indians came, brought mom, brought the kids, brought grandma and grandpa, and they expected to be fed. They weren't out there hunting deer and all. So the British had a huge responsibility. The other problem is, Indian ally telling them what to do is, it got to the point that the Indians began to think that the British were about to abandon them, which they were, and so they were almost as much of a threat to the British as to anyone else. Tecumseh called Proctor, the British commander, a coward, and many of the Indians begin to leave the British. The British in the Battle of Lake Erie, the fleet, they were on half rations. They were unmanned. The people commanding the ships were inexperienced. Perry had similar problems. And so finally, when Harrison invaded, in effect, this huge army, 5,000 people, and then other troops under Richard Mentor Johnson crossed the Detroit River. And so we had a mounted, his mounted regiment was converging. And so Proctor burned Fort Malden, burned Fort Detroit, and began to retreat. So in effect, and these troops that he had were the same troops that had fought at Detroit, Fort Meigs, Second Fort Meigs, Fort Stephenson. He was a poor commander, and they were totally disillusioned. They were fleeing, and they fled up to Lake St. Clair and began to move up the Thames River toward a place called Moravian Town. And Harrison caught up with them at Moravian Town, and this is a schematic of the Battle of Moravian Town, which was pretty one-sided. The British formed a line. Richard Mentor Johnson. Anybody familiar with Richard Mentor Johnson? Vice President of the United States. Whoever heard of most of them, right? Richard Mentor Johnson. He became Vice President under Van Buren. His campaign slogan, you know, everybody knows Harrison's campaign slogan? Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Anybody know Johnson's?
Killed Tecumseh.
Rumsey Dumpsey. Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh. Got him elected, right? How can you beat that? So anyway, Richard Mentor Johnson had an idea. So the army lined up, here's Shelby, and they lined up a huge army. The British down to about 600 troops, disgruntled, lack of supplies, no artillery. And so Johnson had an idea. He had trained his men to simply charge right through the front line and then circle back and attack the line. And so he suggested this to Harrison. So here we have an army of 5,000 people sitting here, right? We have a pretty weak British army, and we have Tecumseh and all the Indians over here in this swamp, all right? So what they did is Richard Mentor Johnson's mounted dragoons charged the British line. The British fired 3-shot volleys, much of it up in the air, almost no casualties. They rode right through the British lines, circled back, and that was the end of the British army. They were captured, all right? Almost none got away. Proctor fled east, was disgraced, and that was the end of his career. So the battle didn't amount to much. On the left, Richard Mentor Johnson, James Johnson, handled this. He went across this small swamp to attack the British. And what he did is he had about 20 guys called the Forlorn Hope. And what they would do is lead this charge. And most of them were killed. Pretty heroic. He was pretty heroic. And in this charge, Johnson killed an Indian chief. And the assumption was that it was, or the credit claimed was that it had been Tecumseh. And I don't think he was. I think he killed an Indian chief, but I don't think it was Tecumseh. This is a contemporary, a sketch of the charge, and this is one of my favorite prints of all time. This is the Indian battle with Richard Mentor Johnson on his horse, and he was shot 3 times, badly wounded in the hand. He did kill a large Indian chief. Many of the other people, Whiteley and the Colonel Whiteley from Kentucky and the Forlorn Hope, were killed. And I think it's kind of an amusing print in a way. Look at all the sticking out of the smoke, the Indian stuff. So this was actually a 45-minute struggle where there were serious casualties and where Tecumseh was killed. When Tecumseh was killed, the Indians abandoned and either fled or basically came over to the American side. So in the background, this is one of Perry's ships. This is Proctor fleeing, and the 3 guys on horseback are Oliver Hazard Perry, who served as an aide-de-camp to General Harrison and Lewis Cass, the future Secretary of State, presidential candidate, governor of Michigan Territory, pretty famous Ohioan, and various people are identified for what they did. And again, after the war, a lot of people claim credit. Johnson, one time somebody said, "Did you kill Tecumseh?" And his answer was clever. He said, "If I didn't, who did?" I don't think he killed him because the battle, he was so badly wounded and was taken from the field, the battle went on for another half hour. And when Tecumseh was killed, the Indians split. So I think he may have been killed by someone else later in the battle. We don't know, because we know after the battle, people were identifying supposed bodies. Tecumseh, Kentucky guys flayed Tecumseh's body and made razor straps out of it. And so yeah, not very dignified. So with this battle, in effect, the War of 1812 in the Northwest was over. And of course, if we think of who won the war, the Canadians will tell you they did. Some people here will say we did. There's no question that the Indians lost. And Northwest Ohio, by 1818, treaties were signed. Indians were assigned Indian reservations throughout Ohio until the Trail of Tears, when they were moved west. And the surveys were completed, and in 1820, this area was open to settlement, and we began a whole new era. So here in our backyard, whether it's the siege of Fort Stephenson, an amphibious, think of this beautiful sight of this amphibious invasion leaving for the shores of Canada right from here, or the siege of Fort Stephenson, just south of here. Probably could have heard some of the artillery. Pretty impressive. So Croghan went on to try to capture Fort Mackinac, was defeated, and the British still had Mackinac at the end of the war. But for all practical purposes, no more Indian threat in Northwest Ohio. So, end of story. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? Yes, Paul.
I would like to recommend a book that deals with all aspects of the war in the Northwest. It's by a Canadian, actually...
A wampum denied.
Sandy Anton.
You got it, yeah. Yeah, I wrote him a letter when I read it. Yeah.
It's just amazing.
It's a great, Alan,
Hungarian that had a career in the
Canadian Army. Right.
And ended up teaching history at Leamington High School.
Right.
And it's absolutely
It's a great book, it really is. Another good one is Alan Eckert's The War of 1812 in the Northwest. Another good one. Yeah, it's great. It's from a British point of view, but it's impartial and it's very accurate. Yeah, it's the best. Yes. A Wampum Denied by Sandy Antal. It's available in paperback. I've seen it pretty frequently for sale. A wampum, a wampum would be denied. Very good account of all of this. Yes.
I always wondered about the flat bottom boats that you referred to as landing craft.
Yes.
Do you think those were used as to transport the infantrymen or?
Infantrymen. No horses were taken across.
But do you think you transported them across Lake Erie or towed those?
People were on Perry's ships, and then Perry's ships towed. And the nice thing is, as soon as Perry arrived in this area, he met with Harrison. Harrison recruited over 100 of his troops to serve on Perry's fleet, and they worked seamlessly. And so here you see at the Battle of the Thames, there's Oliver Hazard Perry right there with William Henry Harrison. I mean, it's just unheard of at this period. In the lower lake, Chauncey, there's no cooperation at all. So this was really important, really a feather in both of their caps. Yeah. Yes?
What's the date of that map that you keep showing of the firelands in Ohio?
Well, it's a series of, it's a series. It originally came out in 1805 and then was updated. So the one I'm showing you would be a slightly later 1815 version.
Oh, okay, that's why the firelands are.
Yes, yeah. Well, the firelands date from the firelands of course, 1792 was created, and then, of course, it was surveyed and opened for settlement in 1809.
One of the questions I always had was, in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, the Indians owned all the way to the...
Absolutely, they owned all the way to the Cuyahoga, and only with the Treaty of Fort Industry, which was in Toledo, in 1805, did the Firelands Company, the Connecticut Land Company, and the federal government purchase the land east of, which became the boundary of the Firelands. So in the War of 1812, if you were in not Erie County, but in the Firelands, everything to the west, like if you were in Bellevue, Indian Territory, there it was, right down the street.
If in 1795, how did they own the land for...
Okay, that's an interesting story. I'll tell you how it worked. All right. So in the Northwest Ordinance in the Articles of Confederation, 1781, all the colonies gave up their western lands, except for two. One, Virginia, kept title, not sovereignty, not control, but the land between the Miami and the Scioto rivers. And that became the Virginia Military District. And they did that so they could pay their soldiers. They couldn't pay them, they didn't have any money, they'd give them land. And of course, that part of the state is the random survey, not like here. Connecticut said their original charter, 1661, Charles II, gave them the land between the 41st and 42nd parallel. Well, they had a problem. New York and Pennsylvania got in the way. But Pennsylvania, their title, was 500 miles. And so there was a firm boundary for Pennsylvania. So Connecticut said, we're keeping our land, 120 miles of it, that sliver, west of the Pennsylvania line. And of that land, 500,000 acres will be given to those people in New London, Lyme, and all the cities, Norwalk, where people had suffered losses. The British had burned their homes or businesses. And so depending on how much damage you had, that's how much a claim you had. And the Firelands is not like where we are right now is the 6 mile square township, you know. These are 5 mile square with 4 sections. And what you did is you drew lots. You had a section line and a township line. And that's what you got. And but of course, until Elm and Rugg, then they surveyed it, and then the survey was wrong. Then they resurveyed it, and finally Elm and Ruggles got it right, and then they could sell it, and then it was awarded. Okay? Yeah. Yes, Paul?
The original charter from Charles II, this 1 degree strip of land ran all the way to the Pacific.
All the way to the Pacific Ocean, yeah. They settled for 120 miles. Yeah. Yeah, and of course, the Connecticut Western Reserve, I mean, it's unique. I mean, it's different than here, and Danbury is different than here by the survey, you know. I mean, and how do we, what's the big deal? Well, where do the roads fall? And how far apart are they? And what about the town squares in the Western Reserve, and, you know, in Milan or in Sandusky? I mean, or Medina. I mean, it's a very different part of the state. Yeah. Yeah. Paul?
Danbury is a French survey. Well, one center line and then the lots running out to both.
Out from either side, yeah. So it's part of...
Same survey as Detroit.
The same as Detroit, okay, yeah. Yeah, because of course there were French, yeah, I mean, the only people living here before the white settlers were French traders, like Flamand on the Huron River, and French orchards, and Frenchmen had been in this area, and so yeah. Yeah, this is a pretty historic area, pretty exciting. Okay, well, thank you very much.